We're recording?
Yes.
Okay. So hi, my name is Brad Newberg. Today I want to talk about sort of the SVG Web Toolkit and some of the work we're doing around open web advocacy. I want to remind everyone that this video is public, so make sure if you ask questions not to say anything that might not be public. So I'm going to keep the talk pretty short, about 30 minutes, to leave a lot of time for QA. I'm going to do a lot of demos. You're going to get to see some interesting use cases of SVG, plus them being used with the SVG Web Toolkit. We'll talk about sort of the open web strategy a little bit and why Google cares about SVG. You know, why should we invest any time and energy into this? Sort of the timeline of where we are. I'll briefly compare and contrast SVG with other things that are out there to kind of figure out where does this fit in. And then I'm going to leave a lot of time for QA, and really, depending on where the audience is, I can crack open the code editor, and we can start seeing how do you use this. I can talk about the internals if you want to know what's going on the inside of the system. So that's the general overview. And at any time, please feel free, again, raise your hand and ask questions. So one thing that's really important to remember is that there's no plugins to download with this. This is a JavaScript toolkit. We're kind of cleverly using facilities that are already present on around 95% of the existing browsers. So we can instantly get coverage. And we've targeted a huge slew of browsers, so IE 6, 7, and 8, Safari, Firefox. So you can start to deploy SVG content across most of the installed base. And that's really important. That was really the focus, not to make some kind of new technology, but to really get to a point so that developers can actually start using part of the technology to kind of get out of that chicken and egg problem, to kind of induce some movement in the system. I want to say, too, that even though we've been working on this, it's been a really amazing team. I've done a lot of open source, and when you have anyone who shows up and can contribute, it's amazing. I've had two of the best people I've ever worked with show up and really do a huge amount of the project. James Height and Rick Masters, these guys are awesome. They've been hacking on their weekends. They contributed a lot of the cool stuff. You'll see we've got basic font support, video and audio, a lot of really cool stuff that they've done, and it's been really amazing. So I want to start out by showing you this is Firefox, and this is the native Firefox support. And what we see here is just standard SVG. We've got some images from Flickr. We can interact with them, scale them. If you were to crack this open, you'd see pretty much JavaScript that looks and feels kind of like the JavaScript when you write JavaScript for an HTML page. But then we can take this and going in Internet Explorer, this is IE 7. And we see the same thing running with the same degree of fidelity. So that's really cool because the developer doesn't even really know about this SVG Web Toolkit. You just add this into your page, and at that point you can start to use the standard as if it's natively supported. If we were to crack open this particular sample, what we would see is a bunch of JavaScript that's sort of scripting SVG elements. When you use the SVG Web Toolkit, you still feel like there's native support. So if we were to crack this open, you'd see things like, you know, familiar friends if you've done JavaScript DOM programming, like getElementById. So in that script, for example, it might grab a circle from the page. That just works. CreateElement. So in HTML, you generally have to say CreateElement form, for example. In this, you have to add the namespace. We actually add a variable into the page to make it a little easier. But there you are. We make a circle. You can even script the style. And again, it looks and feels like you have native support. So here we are changing the fill of a circle to red. And so on. You see we have the DOM. You can manipulate through this, add events. So that's really unique. That's one of the big things is not only does SVG Web support static SVG, but also dynamic. So you can really start to do some interesting things with this. By default, we only use kind of the magic that we're doing on Internet Explorer, and we use the native support on Firefox, Safari, and Chrome. However, you can optionally override that and have SVG Web do all of its magic on those browsers too. Now, what's cool about that is that you can go beyond. So here we are. So instead of photos now we have videos that we can manipulate. And keep in mind, this is Internet Explorer 7. And this is running in a virtual machine. This is the Bruno trailer and the new Star Trek trailer. So that's pretty cool. Now, the video support, that's not natively supported by any browsers yet. So what's unique is we can optionally override the native support in a browser, going away from the default. In order to get those extra features. Now that's really cool. That means that your project, you can start by using the native support and all those other browsers. But then if you hit some bug that's in the native implementation, or you want to use something that may not be as widely supported yet, you can then toggle on SVG Web, and it will sort of start using the same magic. And you'll see the same thing. The JavaScript will interact with the SVG, and it will look and feel like it's really a part of the browser. This becomes really cool because I'm going to show you fonts, SVG fonts. Those are natively supported by Safari, but not by Firefox yet. So by, in that scenario, turning this on, you can then get that same 95% coverage. So that's really cool. So that can also act as a positive spur to help try out some of the newer things, see how those gel with developers, and then the other browsers can sort of natively fill those in. Just before I jump on, any questions so far? What you've seen? No questions? Yes, Roman.
So this is using Flash?
Yeah, so Roman's question, is this using Flash? On the inside, we use a slew of different tricks. So we use Flash to do the displaying. We use something called Microsoft Behaviors to actually kind of get some of the magic around the JavaScript type work. The reason we choose Flash is that it has a 97% install base. So like I said, we kind of cleverly use various facilities that are already present on the browsers so the user doesn't have to install anything. So right, the actual rendering when SVG Web does its magic is Flash.
Which version?
We use Flash 9 and forward, which is the one that has, so we're not using Flash 10 yet because it doesn't have as much coverage. Good question. So, right, like I said, you can use this. This is the whole reason we did this. Today, you can use this to deploy real content across 95% of the existing web. So that was the goal. And it's as easy as dropping a script source into your page. When we get to the QA, I can go a little bit more into what configuration and deployment looks like. But basically, you add a script to your page. And at this point, we're supporting a lot of the SVG 1.1 standard. There's some areas that aren't covered. And there's a few areas where you have to slightly change what you're doing. But in general, there's a tremendous amount of it just feels like native support. Now, there's actually two ways to embed. We support using the object tag as a syntax similar to this. And then we also support dropping directly into normal HTML. So you can drop this into normal HTML. It doesn't have to be XHTML. It can just be normal, plain vanilla HTML. And the way you do that is we actually, and HTML5 allows this, by the way. You use a script tag and you set the MIME type, and then you just drop your SVG right into the page. So that can really be nice for certain scenarios because you might have normal HTML. Your JavaScript in the page can still manipulate this. You can integrate with HTML a little better. So those are the two deployment options we support right now. So I want to show you a couple of cool demos. This Tetris demo is actually written where it's embedded directly into a normal HTML page. And I'm going to show this in Safari, but it's actually overwriting the native renderer. And we have Tetris. It was really fun debugging this actually, because I'd get to to play Tetris while I'm working, which is nice. And here we are, IE. So again, pretty straightforward stuff. That's what's great. It just looks and feels the same. This is a really cool one. One of the volunteers in our community put this together. One of the unique things about SVG, and I'll go over when do you want to use SVG versus Canvas, where does it make sense. One of the really nice things about SVG is it can make really sense for sort of when you want something that's more than an image. And what you're going to see for this is a population pyramid. It's pulling population statistics for different countries. And in real time, you can translate all the text on the page to different languages, into Russian, into Cyrillic, into German. That's really cool because at the end of the day, SVG is just text, which is really nice too, because it's really easy to make a PHP script or an app engine script that just shoots out SVG that might have data embedded into it. This is a nice use case. So this is actually Safari with its native support. We see the two different population demographics. And I'll actually do all the toggling in IE so you can get to see how this guy actually works. So the monitor's a little small, but right here we have a language toggle. Let's change this into Russian. And you see that it's now been translated into Russian. Now what's really cool is, again, because this is more than an image, it's text, you can do things like that. And you can also interact with it. So outside of this, it's a normal HTML page. And as we go over this, we've directly embedded SVG into the page using that script tag approach you saw. So something like this, I know the volunteer who created this, he used an existing kind of demo. He was able to put this together really fast. So running an IE. I like to call this is the hello world of vector graphics. If you've ever, Rafe laughs, he knows this one. The reason I want to show you this one is one of the things that makes SVG unique is the fact that it's resolution independent. You are able to give one size, and whether you're looking at an iPhone or you're looking at a 40-inch monitor, what you're dealing with can scale and still stay beautiful and still stay legible. So this is the tiger. This is the hello world of vectors. And just showing you, we're going to zoom in. This is actually known as the view box. By default, an SVG image will just display how it needs to display. But you can have more control over that with what's called a view box to say, you know, actually fit it into something really, really big. So it's going to zoom out, or something really, really small. So you can actually animate that and do interesting things. Here right now, we've just toggled a button to change the view box. So notice as we zoom in, it doesn't pixelate. It stays beautiful. So you can imagine on an iPhone, which has good SVG support, as the user pinches and zooms in, the text, the images is going to stay legible and nice. So fonts. We've got basic font support. And what's really unique about SVG fonts is they're just text. I like to call them, they're a cut and paste technology. And I'll show you a little snippet. Safari natively supports them. Let me show you what that looks like. This right here is actually the Droid Sans font, which comes with the Android phone, which is a nice font that's actually open sourced. And we just ran it through a little converter and turned it into SVG fonts, which is just plain text you drop into your page, just like you would an image. Here it is natively supported, but then we come over to IE, and we see the same thing with the same fidelity. So what's really, again, when it comes, again, keep in the back of your mind, 95% coverage. Drop a JavaScript library into the page. You know, this isn't just showing you, hey, this is cool stuff you can use 5 years from now. You know? Yes, Rafe.
Are those fonts rendered as sort of shape fills, or are they rendered using the full font rendering capability of the browser with like ClearType on Windows and so on and so forth?
So the question is, are these fonts being rendered as shape fills, or are they going into the sort of full OS support? So SVG fonts are interesting. They are, you can think of them more at the application layer. You define a glyph, like you say, here's the letter A, and then you say, and here's the SVG commands to draw that. So it's not dropping down into native OS support. And we only support a subset. We only say you can have a path statement. Mm-hmm. So, right, you're not going to get any sort of acceleration or other things that might be at the OS layer.
It's the subpixel rendering that's really, you know, that's
right.
That's one of the arguments for, I think, Canvas.
Yeah.
HTML5 is that it does have that kind of font rendering fidelity.
So the question is getting the subpixel rendering. It's one of the arguments for the HTML5 Canvas. Yeah. So there's pros and cons. So the nice thing about this is something you can start using. Personally, I really hope the sort of CSS way of importing a true type file or open type file, I hope that in the long run becomes the standard way to do things. But it could be a while. Mm-hmm. So good question. I'd like to say, you know, when would you use this? And I want to show you a sample of when this makes sense. One of the nice things about SVG is you can start combining these things together. You'll see some animation, some fonts, some filters. So whenever you want to start combining these things together, that's when it makes sense. If you just want a nice headline, this is probably overkill. And you probably want to use something called like Cipher or something like that. So when you want to start doing fancy things, I'll show you a good demo in a little bit where you're combining these things in an interesting way, then it starts making sense. Oh, and I also want to say, of course, the iPhone supports SVG fonts. Yes?
What about Android? Last time I checked, it didn't have a terminal.
Yeah, Android is an unfortunate story. Android is something we can't support. Doesn't have, they use WebKit, but they've clipped out a lot of WebKit extensions. There's some cool stuff in WebKit that's simply clipped out. Plus, there's no Flash, so there's not much we can do. It's an unfortunate situation. So I'm going to have this load up an SVG font demo on the iPhone. I guess we don't have a camera. I might have to pass this around the audience, huh? I don't know if we can get this up on the screen. You probably can't see it. You can kind of see exactly the same font. And of course, this really does support as you zoom in and out. So I'm going to give this to you. Feel free to hand it around and zoom in and out. So like I said, they're really straightforward. They're just text. They're just a bunch of glyphs, right? You say glyph name equals A. Here's how you define A. You give your data. You can technically actually support full SVG. We only support the path statement, which gets you pretty far right now. And right, if you're rendering a whole document or you want something with that kind of subpixel, you're not going to get that right now. So we fully support you scripting with JavaScript, but there's a couple of downsides with that. That's really good for more experienced developers. We also support basic animation. This is also known as Smile, but we support basic Smile. So this can be really nice for more beginner developers. It also actually allows us to do some performance improvements when you're actually using SVG Web, because we don't have to do as much talking back and forth, so you can get better performance. But here's an example of that. I'm going to show you a video, and you can actually add these to all sorts of tags. So right here, we're adding a video tag. I've kind of clipped off some of the attributes so it can fit. And then we say animate, and it's really straightforward. We're saying animate the width from 400 to 300 pixels, start at 2 seconds after the document's loaded, go for 5 seconds, and then when it's done, freeze at the final state. So that's, I mean, you could do that with JavaScript, but it's pretty nice to be able to do it with a simple tag, especially, again, if you have some PHP or an app engine that's spitting out some code, that can just add it in for like animate a menu or something in. So this is actually combining those animation tags along with SVG audio. So there's no JavaScript. You see the little scimitar shimmering things. So there's no JavaScript in this page. It's just those animation tags. I didn't have this, and I think Rick Masters might have added that, the music. I think it's like open source music or something. So again, and if you were to crack this one open, you'd see a bunch of animate tags. You'd see one of the cool things about SVG is you can group things together, just like in Photoshop. You know, you can grab all these things, group them together, treat them as a unit. Same thing in SVG. We can actually have some quite complicated drawing commands for the scimitar, which might have been exported from Illustrator. And we could say, as a group, you know, animate this from this exposition to this exposition with a single tag. And then start this music when things happen. And again, one of the cool things is you can animate all sorts of things. So here we are. This is actually kind of a test page. You see various different things there. Any of the jerkiness is because I'm playing this in a virtual machine inside of Mac OS X. So we had those different squares that we're moving based on the animate tags. Of course, you can also say not just on duration, but you can say start or stop something when you have an event that happens, such as a click. There we are restarting. So that's still pretty experimental, but we have quite a lot already in. Now, remember I mentioned how some of the stuff comes together when you combine them together? We're hosting in the fall the SVG Open Conference here at Google, and here's the banner that they've made. And this is a really nice kind of showing everything coming together. This is IE7 again. You'll see sort of things fly in. The screen's a little dark, so the contrast isn't correct. But over in the upper right, you see SVG Open. That's more yellow on my screen. That's a font with a blur filter on it. You see gradients. Everything that flew in is just these simple animate tags. And this was a great use case. This file was written by someone who's not a programmer. They're a graphic designer, but they were able to use Illustrator and Inkscape, put it together, and then put these things together pretty quickly. So why SVG? Why does Google care about SVG? So one of the things that's important is SVG is sort of a part of the HTML5 family of technologies. I'll touch on that a little bit more, but HTML5 talks about here's how you embed SVG into a normal HTML page. One of the things I really respect about the HTML5 process is you need to show that there's market demand. You need to show that there's some valid use cases for something to make it into HTML5. I like that process. So the SVG folks showed here are some valid use cases where this is important. So it's as a part of the HTML5 initiative, and Firefox 3.5 actually has support for this. It's not turned on by default yet, but it's probably going to come soon. What's exciting about that, in the past you had to use XHTML, which like 0.0000001% might have used to use SVG, and now you can drop it into the 99.9 repeating bar that most content is under, and that's nice. It kind of frees things up. One of the really unique things about SVG is it's searchable. Now, this doesn't make sense when you have a tiger illustration, but when you have an electoral map of the US with all the states, such as Wikipedia, and I'll talk about Wikipedia in a bit, we're talking about, it makes sense. When you've got a medical diagram, you've now opened up a lot of interesting content, especially expert-oriented content that can now be searched. And it's in our interest to make sure the web doesn't become big binary blobs. I mean, that makes sense for certain use cases like video, but it's nice when we can prevent that, you know, and have open searchable things. I already mentioned market demand. One of the unique things about SVG is it uses existing web skills. So when we get to QA, I can crack open one of these things, but again, it pretty much feels like you're interacting with a DOM. It's JavaScript, HTML, and so on, CSS. One thing I like to say is these are view source technologies. It's already been great getting these things. I always look for test cases, and I learn just by view source. You know, that population demo, if that had been a big binary blob, I could have been like, hey, that's really cool. How'd you do that? And they may not have told me. But I was able to crack it open and say, wow, that's an interesting, that's nice, and I learned. So these are cut and paste technologies, just like the YouTube embed script. So if you see something that you like, and of course you always have to respect copyright, but that's inherent in HTML already, then you can learn, and if something is open, you can easily use it. Like that open font. That Droid Sans font is open source. So if you like it, you could cut and paste it, add it into your file, and go forward. One of the really cool things is it's really server friendly. Yes, you can have PHP that spits out some binary flash or something like that. It's not easy. It's really easy to do that, especially now that we allow you to direct embed into normal HTML. We use it. We use it, for example, in Presently, in Google Maps. In our internal library closure, we use it as sort of one of our drawing surfaces when there's native support. And finally, one of the really key use cases is import and export. When you're dealing with assets, when you have like that map of the US, and I want to show you a really cool demo that shows Canvas being used with SVG. You don't want that to be 10,000 lines of JavaScript calls drawing a map of the US. You know, what you want is you want to import that resource as SVG and then add whatever magic on top of that using Canvas. That's where that starts to make sense. So I want to quickly touch on the timeline. Actually, there's a couple details I didn't mention. One is the library is 60K. So if you have native support, you obviously don't take that hit, but that's pretty nice. You have a lot of support in 60K. Right now we have an alpha build. Wikipedia, they have a monster repository of SVG. They're going to use SVG Web to present that stuff to Internet Explorer. I'm working with them on a tool for that. The big focus right now is performance and bug fixes and community support. Sort of people are already starting to use this. In the fall, the first week of October, we're hosting the SVG Open Conference here at Google. There's going to be lots of the Raphael folks are going to be there, Dojo GFX. I know Gavin's involved with some of those folks. There's going to be a lot of really interesting presentations, and we're also going to kind of more formally unveil the work we've been doing with this along with others outside. And at that, I originally wanted to have a beta release. I think it's going to be more of an early access release. And of course, more advocacy in terms of the timeline. You know, so I've mentioned this open web strategy. When we started our open web advocacy group, we were like, what the heck is this? What does it mean to do open web advocacy? And we took as our goal, we want to help accelerate the rate at which developers can actually use this stuff. And we saw ourselves as a bit more of sort of a cross-browser team. And one of the ways we sort of mapped out how do you do this is we came up with what we called communication, credibility, and capability. So we said capability is just actually being able to use something. You know, where can I use CSS3, for example? Like getting that capability across enough browsers that developers feel comfortable using it. So native browser support, all the great work that the WebKit and Chrome teams have been doing in terms of getting good browser support. And then JavaScript toolkits. That's my background. That's where I can help contribute. Sort of JavaScript shims that can help get the capability up faster so we don't have to wait so long. And then credibility. This is something that more proprietary plugins have done very well. They'll make claims like you can run this, you know, more than 90% on the web. We wanted to come up with similar numbers and then use those JavaScript toolkits to help that. So we can now say you can use this almost on 100%. We say 95% to be conservative. That's up there. Without the JavaScript toolkit, it's more like 30%. So developers, when they see numbers like that, feel more comfortable starting to use something. And then getting traditional advocacy wins. So Wikipedia or folks that embrace using this and say, hey, we've done this, here's how we're doing it, here's how you can do it too. And then finally, communication, blogging, articles, presentations. So that's kind of how we think about what the heck we're doing on the Open Web Advocacy team when we started. So before I jump on, any questions about what you've seen so far? Any questions over VC? No questions? All right. So I want to quickly compare and contrast. I'm going to skip to the HTML5 because we already spoke about how this fits with HTML5. It's not necessarily a part of the spec, but the spec says, here's how you embed SVG into normal HTML. And that is a major new feature of HTML5. How does it fit with Canvas? Well, I want to show you a really, really cool mashup of the Canvas and SVG tags that Mozilla did, that I think really helps show the various strengths of the two technologies. So this is the, this doesn't use SVG Web at all. This uses native support. This is a download tracker for the Mozilla downloads. What you see on the left is a map of the US. On the right, you see the browser's kept open, a persistent connection over to the server in real time to find out who's downloading something. And then you see, it might be a little small, unfortunately. You see those little red dots that are appearing on top. You see as I zoom in, see them appearing and disappearing? The map is SVG. The red dots are Canvas. The red dots aren't interactive. SVG excels when you want to do light interactivity in a user interface-oriented manner. Because we don't need that, the Canvas dots, that's a really good use case of Canvas. So this is a nice sort of mashup that shows the technologies together. And so one of the strengths, and which also can be one of the weaknesses, you have to choose your battles. SVG is like HTML. You get a DOM. When you add something, when you add a rectangle or a square, it's an object. You have a rectangle or square on the page. That can be really nice because it means that you can add event handlers easily. It retains its identity. You can enumerate all those things. You can really do interesting things with that. Things like this, for example, adding an event handler is very straightforward. Now, if you're doing a side-scrolling game that has no mouse interactivity and uses the keyboard to jump back and forth, you don't want that tree. You want Canvas. You want to just blit pixels. So in graphics parlance, these are known as a retained API and an immediate mode API. And in general, you choose the right one for your project, and if you choose an immediate mode API and you really wanted the retained mode, that means you're rebuilding all event detection and hit detection. You're building the tree yourself. That's a lot of code. It's a lot of bugs. It's a lot of time spent. So SVG is a retained mode API. Yeah. And Canvas is immediate mode. And so here we see SVG in that case is more high level, which depending on your needs helps you or hurts you. And Canvas is more low level. And again, that can be a pro or a con. So when you start a project, you ask yourself things like, do I need import and export? Am I dealing with assets? Do I have Tiger illustrations? Do I have, things like that? SVG excels at that. It's very easy to make a user interface. If I had to do the population demo that you saw, that would be challenging with Canvas. I could do it, but it's not really a great use case. Interactive, especially when you start getting lightly interactive, SVG really is good at that. Medium animation, and by the way, that's also going to be true for Canvas. Flash is fast. It's very fast. Both Canvas and SVG, depending on the implementation, there's a performance differential of 10 to 30% between each other. And that's narrowing over time. It's probably about 15%. But both of them if you throw lots of objects on the page, 10,000 bouncing balls, you're going to bring both of them to their knees. So choose your battles. And again, you have a tree of objects. Canvas really excels when you're doing, when I say non-interactive, the keyboard, if you're using the keyboard for a game, for example, that's not really interacting with the stuff that's on the page. It's kind of outside of that. So that's a good use case. I want to say SVG has accessibility written into it. It's a little bit more complicated of a story, but you can make your files accessible. None of the screen readers yet read it, but when they do, if you write your things right, they will be able to correctly say, this is a scimitar, this is a population graph. So there you go. Any questions about Pixel? And I want to say one thing that's really important is that both Flash and Silverlight have arrived at the fact that they need both, which is actually true. Sometimes in the open source world we can have like GNOME versus KDE battles, or we always like civil wars, but you actually need both. And personally, Canvas is very important, and so is SVG, and but the corollaries are showing up on the other side. Flash 11 Flex 4 is going to have something called FXG, which is basically SVG with, global replace, change a couple of names. And then, of course, there's the Flash Drawing API, which corresponds quite strongly to the Canvas API. That's what we use internally in order to do a lot of the work. Silverlight, of course, has XAML, again, which is markup. You have a circle tag and so on. And then there is a Drawing API. So those are going to have both. We don't want to walk around with just one arm. We want to be able to have both in the open communities as well. So here's the project page. I'm going to jump into QA. I'll jump into QA in 1 second. And I'll take questions. We've got about 15 minutes. So depending on where the audience is at, maybe that's enough. Maybe you want to crack open some code, know more about the internals. But yeah, you have a question.
It sounded like you were saying that there isn't much performance difference between Canvas and SVG. So what would be the advantage of using Canvas?
So the question is, it sounds like I said that there's not much performance difference between Canvas and SVG. So what would be the benefits of Canvas? So I didn't say that. Okay. There is a performance difference. Last I saw, someone found about a 20% performance. I saw a study about a year and a half ago, 20 to 30%. Again, neither of them is a silver bullet. Like I said, you have to choose what you're doing. If I were doing a side-scrolling game, or if I was doing a non-interactive graphic visualization with 10,000 data points, I would use Canvas.
So the advantage of Canvas is speed for non-interactive stuff.
It's exactly when their benefits become their cons. So when if I wanted to have an interactive population graph with all those lines, that would be a nightmare to build in Canvas. I'd have to rebuild a whole bunch of facilities that I get for free.
No, I understand what the disadvantages of Canvas are.
Yeah.
The advantage of Canvas, you're saying, is speed in a non-interactive setting. Is that right?
Yeah, when I don't need to interact with all the stuff on the screen. And if you have a tremendous data set, actually you're going to bring both of them to their knees currently. But if you have a very, very large data set, I probably wouldn't want the bookkeeping of SVG with 10,000 data nodes. But if I wanted something that's search engine friendly, spit out by PHP. So I think at this point developers need to know when to use either one and how to do it. Good question. Yes. Oh, I think we have one.
Yeah, I had one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, any hopes of shimming out Canvas for us as well?
So that's already handled by the excellent XCanvas library. Emil Eklund, Eric Arvidsson. That's using VML under the covers. I know they've been exploring other renderers like Silverlight. It's a mature project at this point. It's been out for a few years. They were supporting a huge amount of the API. I know there's some newer things that are you looking at supporting those things, or actually, do you want to answer the question? Why don't you come so it's recorded? We've got one of the creators of the XCanvas library, which really is like the sister project of SVG Web.
So Explorer Canvas currently supports most of the Canvas specification. There are some newer additions to it though, like saving image data and clipping and certain gradient support that is very hard for us to support with VML, which is the back end of the Explorer Canvas emulation.
Well, also VML rendering quality is kind of crappy, especially with like curved lines and things. And I'm just wondering if we could get a higher fidelity canvas by using different rendering technology.
We've been exploring that, and we currently have an alternative renderer using Silverlight. We have not looked into using Flash at the moment, but maybe we could combine our forces and do that in the future.
That's interesting. I know that the Silverlight work is really interesting. Yeah, maybe, especially we've done a lot of work around eking out performance over the Flash.js bridge. That might be useful. And especially if you can combine, I know Ray Cromwell's done a lot of cool work. If you can introduce batch operations, maybe just slightly add a couple of methods saying, for example, last week I implemented suspend redraw, which has helped performance hugely. And this week I'm doing document fragment. So these are all essentially batch operations, which are really helping performance. The Canvas API doesn't currently have those in them, but if you could add them, start batch, in batch. I know Ray Cromwell's done some good work. That could help performance. But you're right, there is some impedance mismatch. We have that over in the Flashland too. You have Bezier curves. There's some certain things. We've been able to patch over a lot of those. There's a few things we can't support, like smaller than 1 pixel line drawings and stuff. But it's, Does that answer your question, Gavin? Okay. So, any other questions? Yeah. Uh-huh. So the question is, how is the performance over the Flash.js boundary for SVG Web, especially for event handling? The first thing to say is a shim will never match native performance. This is a temporary solution. Unfortunately, on the web, temporary means like 3 years, if you're lucky, actually. So, it will always be less. But I've been able, it's a real focus of mine now. I've had lots of performance sort of sessions where I focus on performance. One of the things I'm really looking at now. I've been able to, the last 2 weeks, get 100% fold speed improvement with some of the things I've been doing. And I'm hitting some other things. So it's okay right now. If you may have seen, some of the samples loaded very fast. And some of them, like the Tiger, when they start getting more complicated, can take a little while. But I don't think we've hit the ceiling of how you can get performance faster. And I'll give one sample of that. The Flash.js boundary is always going to be slower. There's other possibilities. One is when you batch things up. So combining everything with a suspend redraw, if I'm affecting 500 elements on the screen, like the population graph, I can turn that into one Flash.js call that says, here's what's to change. Other things I'm exploring is if you use Smile, if you programmatically create a Smile element, does the animation tags and send them over, at that point, everything lives in the rendering engine, and you could potentially get very fast performance. So there's all sorts of things I'm exploring along this continuum. Is that? And I haven't yet had a use case that had tremendous numbers of events arriving from the other side. So I haven't seen a bottleneck yet on that one. Yeah, I haven't seen a bottleneck yet on that, but I'm always looking for good use cases that help find bottlenecks because those help me optimize. Gavin?
Brett? Yeah, I had one other question, which was about normalizing SVG support across browsers. So, for all the browsers except for IE, effectively, we have SVG. And you've done a lot of work presenting a normal API. do you have this idea of like bridging? So, for example, if a browser doesn't support Smile, can you implement Smile for that browser, or is this just like you want to drop into Flash as quickly as possible?
Yeah, I don't have it that fine-grained. I started out with a whole complicated capabilities type of thing, and I was like, I'm going to make this the simplest I can until I see actually what developers want. So at this point, it's a binary decision. You can drop a meta tag into your page, and the meta tag says, name equals svg.render.forceFlash, and that's true or false, and that will force Flash for all browsers. You can also override it on the URL, which can help when you're testing. I will probably at some point introduce the ability to target some specific user agents. I've been surprised. Safari's SVG support is excellent, so is Opera's. Firefox's, So I might make it possible for you to say, use SVG Web on IE and Firefox, and let Safari and Chrome do their thing natively, and Opera. So no, the answer to your question right now is no, it's a binary decision. And again, remember, I want to really avoid this being laser focused. This provides dynamic and static SVG support. I don't want this to turn into an Uber toolkit that tries to be a complete emulation of the entire standards-based web. And even I'm not even that wedded to standards. It's more, at this point, we're going to start experimenting, for example, with an extra add-on library at some point to make using SVG much more terse. Rafe?
On the SVG text, SVG fonts, what kind of support is there for complex scripts and so on and so forth?
That's a good question. So the question is, when it comes to the SVG web fonts, what kind of support is there for complex scripts? I didn't build the SVG font support. Rick Masters did. So I'm not as deep into the details. SVG fonts have a lot of support for quite a lot of control over the kerning, going pretty deep, and it is internationalized. I would suspect we obviously don't have left or right to left control what we have now. Since everything is just a path, I'm sure you could define, here's a Thai character. But I don't think it would dynamically go right to left if that was needed. Okay. So you could display internationalized glyphs because they're under your control. But top to bottom, right to left. Is that kind of what you had in mind?
Well, more things like automatic ligatures and contextual substitutions, contextual alternates, that kind of stuff. It's very fast.
Yeah, so when it comes to the animation video, we hit the low-hanging fruit.
Sure. On
a lot of those. The SVG 1.1 support of the core is quite strong. But for those kind of low-hanging fruits, we're like, we're so close, and they're really cool. So we hit probably the 80%, but when it comes to more advanced, that's going to have to grow over time. And by the way, I don't think, if you notice, this is a very iterative approach, right? We want to get, that's always been the idea, can you get a usable set of this stuff that you can use in a production environment? Just like what we did with CSS. You get enough, it solves real use cases, and you grow from there. And you hit enough browsers that folks can actually use this stuff. All right, let's take one more question and then. Or not. Okay, everyone, thanks so much.